What's important is, as long as you have optimized your talents and your skills that you've been given, your God-given skills, to make a meaningful impact and or difference, then you have succeeded. And that is far more beneficial than any economic wealth.
Welcome to a new episode of Most Memorable Journeys. My guest today is an amazing group senior executive at Aspen Pharmacare and a global health leader. He has an honorary doctorate and he's one of the global top 100 influential people in African healthcare. He serves on many boards, and man, the awards, I was going to mention the awards, but then there were so many that I thought the episode would be over by the time I have mentioned all the awards. Welcome to Most Memorable Journeys, Dr. Stavros Nicolaou.
Elizabeth, good afternoon, and thanks very much for having me. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be with you.
When Andrew suggested that we would have a chat together, I didn't really know who you were. And when I started Googling and checking you out, I thought, oh my God, I hope he'll do it. So, Stavros, what is your Cypriot connection?
Firstly, I was born in South Africa, in Johannesburg, from two Cypriot parents. So my ancestry is very much Cypriot. So I consider myself to be a Cypriot South African as opposed to a South African Cypriot. There is a difference. I'm incredibly proud of my Greek Cypriot ancestry, my heritage. If you were to visit my house, it looks like the museum in Paphos with all the mosaics. So my wife's imported all these mosaics from Greece and from Cyprus. So it is probably the closest you will find to a Cypriot museum in South Africa. So I'm extremely proud and enormously proud of that heritage. And it is something that I try and instill into my family as well. My parents, as I said, are both of Cypriot origin. They're both unfortunately deceased now. But I do try and keep the customs, traditions, the religion certainly, and to a degree the language. I do try and keep those going with this next generation, being my two kids.
So your parents spoke to you in Greek?
They did. They spoke to me with very much a Cypriot dialect, actually. But I was fortunate enough to attend some Greek classes. So I recognize both, the Cypriot dialect as well as the Greek language. So I recognize both.
Yeah, and for the people who are listening and don't know what we're talking about, the Cypriot language is actually a dialect, and it's based obviously on the Greek language. But when two Cypriots speak together a little fast, a Greek person may not understand everything. And it's more or less exactly the same difference between German and Swiss German, because Swiss German isn't a written language. And when we speak, the Germans don't understand us.
Yeah, it's a very good analogy.
Yeah. So now, where do we begin? You grew up in South Africa. Did you travel? Did you visit Cyprus? Did your parents come home or back to Cyprus a lot?
I came and was born into extremely humble beginnings and lived for many years. In fact, for my first 26 years or so, I lived in very humble dwellings. I had to share a bedroom with my sister. There was sort of one bedroom and one dining room, come lounge. So very humble beginnings. And I only ever got to travel once overseas, and that was to Cyprus in 1970 when I was 5 years old then with my parents. It was the first and only overseas trip I ever undertook with my father. And it was the first time my father went back to Cyprus for around 40 years. So he left when he was very young. He was 15 years old when he left Cyprus and came to a foreign country with unknown prospects, which was not an uncommon story at that time. And the only time, as I say, that I managed to travel with him was, in fact, to Cyprus. Then it took about another 16 years for me to travel to Cyprus again. I was quite fortunate as a student. I studied pharmacy here in South Africa, but I became aged 21, 22. I became the International Pharmacy Student Federation vice chairman. This was a student organization that had about 60 countries as members, and I got to travel extensively on my vice presidential duties. And as part of that travel, I slotted in 2 visits to Cyprus, and I went back and was able to meet some of my family as well. And then I got quite conscientized and seized to what we commonly call the Cypriot problem. This is the illegal Turkish invasion of Cyprus, and the Turks still occupy 36% of the most fertile land of Cyprus. I became quite conscientized later on in life, and in 1996 to 1999, I was the South African representative and vice president of an organization called PSECA, which is the International Coordinating Committee Justice for Cyprus. And I led a campaign here in South Africa, which inter alia called for Turkey to respect the UN Security Council resolutions as they pertain to Cyprus. And there were a number of successes. There was a resolution passed in the South African Parliament. There was a statement that the Deputy Foreign Minister of South Africa issued condemning Turkey's actions. I was part of a team together with the late and great legal mind and Nelson Mandela's lawyer, George Bezos, who's of Greek origin. So George and I worked on preventing the arms sales to Turkey by the South African government at the time. They were going to sell Roy Falk helicopters. We were successfully lobbying against that sale from taking place. We also were successful. This was mainly George, but I did assist him. We were successful in getting Nelson Mandela to, on 2 occasions, decline the Kemal Ataturk Award. So obviously when I was involved in that period, there were frequent visits to Cyprus. I stepped down in the early 2000s, and we restructured somewhat. We went into sort of mainstream South African politics as an entry point into the more geopolitical sphere of things. But certainly the period that I was active with PSECA required regular visits to Cyprus.
Fantastic. And yet,
And I should mention one other thing that's of relevance, I think, is that my late dad passed away in 1982. I was 16 years old at the time. And on his deathbed, I promised him that I would, if I had a son, that I would christen my son at the monastery, Banaya Dugiku, or as the Cypriots say, Banaya Dugiku, right? So, and it's a promise I fulfilled. So, immensely proud that in 2003, my son Haralambos, who we call Harry, was christened at the monastery, and it has huge both religious and social significance. Of course, it's where the late Archbishop Macarius also trained, so it has significant relevance. But I got to fulfill that undertaking that I made to my late dad.
beautiful. Lots and lots of history. And yet it's the 22nd of July, 2 days ago. It was 51 years that the invasion started. And 2 days ago, the airport in Nicosia closed forever. Because I did a podcast episode with Adamos Marneros, who was the last pilot who ever landed in Nicosia. Very sad story, but this did not stop you from trying. And I think the way I understand, you are still trying. And I think one should never give up. Now, I want to ask you something else. Lots of Cypriots who lived in South Africa, who were born in South Africa, have come back to Cyprus. Have you ever thought about coming back?
Yeah, they have. So I think if you follow the history of certainly Greek Cypriots, and I differentiate between the two, of course, which is maybe not the right thing to do. But there are those who claim to be Turkish Cypriot as well. So there were kind of three waves. You had the first wave of migrants to South Africa was in the 1930s. That was at the time of the Great Depression. Then there was the second wave, and incidentally, my dad was, my late dad was part of the first wave, and that was in the 30s. The second wave was shortly after the World War, and of course, both periods were characterized by significant economic downturn, poverty in Europe, etc. So that's what characterized those two periods. So there was a second wave post the World War. That's when my mom came to South Africa. And then there was a third period, which was shortly after the Turkish invasion in 1974. So you had those three waves. And at a point in time, the strength of the South African Cypriot community numbered around 50 to 60,000, probably closer to 60,000. It's now shrunk to about half that size, partly for two reasons. We went into a democratic era post 1994, the much heralded Mandela era. I think that didn't always fit with some of the Cypriot community's future prospects. So I think you had shortly thereafter some wave of immigration. And then in more recent times, I think largely due to some safety and security concerns, you've had a second wave of immigration. So you've had three waves when people from Cyprus came into South Africa and two waves where they left. But the strength of the South African Cypriot community probably numbers about 30,000 these days. And they spread throughout South Africa. Most of them are in sort of the main city, which is Johannesburg, but they're pretty much spread around the country.
That is still a lot of people from a country that has only 1 million inhabitants when you look at it. I mean, lots of them. I think there are a lot who, I'm not 100% sure, who sometimes regret a little bit that they came back to Cyprus, even though it's very beautiful here. But opportunities there were also big. And I'm not sure. Sometimes I speak to people and I can hear a little bit of regret out of it. I don't know. Now,
no, I think there is often regret, and I think out of interest, the expat South African community in Paphos numbers about 8,000. So if you think about the size of Paphos, we've got 8,000 South African expats. It's a big number, and it tells a story in itself. But what I'm always fascinated by is that when South Africa play rugby, an international rugby game, our much famous and fabled Springboks, we were the world champions, and the most successful rugby nation in the world. It's so interesting to see how many former South Africans go and follow these games, the Springbok games, at the various bars and clubs and sporting facilities. It's very interesting to see that. So there's a natural affinity and affection, I think, still to South Africa by the Paphos expat community.
yeah, that's my son played rugby here in Cyprus for the Mouflons.
Okay, so you should send him over for a few games here in South Africa.
Yeah.
Always very good to watch.
I never understood the rules. Maybe I didn't study it enough and I never bothered enough, but it's a bit rough. And especially when your son plays and you watch it, it's for a mother, it's quite rough to watch your son playing rugby.
Yeah, the rule is watch others play, but never let your son play. That's the rule.
Is that the rule?
That's the rule, yeah.
Let's talk about Aspen Pharmacare. How it's a very, very huge, large corporation. You have been involved for 35 years, am I right?
Yeah, around 30 years, yes.
Around 30 years. You were saying that you came from very humble beginnings. You studied pharmacy, but from what I understand, you have a lot of drive. Do you think that people who come from humble beginnings have this desire to succeed? Is there, do you think that people who have it all sorted out for them are more complacent?
Okay, great. So the best way for me to respond is, I think, to provide some anecdotes about my own experiences. The first anecdote I'd like to share in response is that my family and I always had an inkling for me to become a medical doctor, physician. But I went into university age 17. I had just lost my father, and we were on an extremely tight budget. And I only had sufficient budget to study for 4 years. And it wasn't easy in those days to get sponsorships or bursaries or scholarships. It's a lot easier today. But in those days, it was quite a foreign concept. So I said, well, look, if I can't do medicine, what am I going to do? Let me do something in a similar field. I was always fascinated by medicine and chemistry. Even in my school years, very fascinated by it. So I said, okay, well, pharmacy is the course for me to do. And when I was completing my first year of pharmacy, in fact, it was at the end of first year, I read a book which changed my life. The book is called Strong Medicine, authored by Arthur Haley, a very famous writer, who's not really known to be a scientific or medicine writer, but he wrote this bestseller called Strong Medicine. What is Strong Medicine about? It's a book on the thalidomide fiasco that took place in the 1960s. So for listeners who are not aware of what happened with thalidomide, thalidomide was a drug introduced in the 1960s in the United States and Europe. It was used for morning sickness. And after some months, a very concerning trend, a side effect, or what we call an adverse event today, started manifesting. The babies born to these mothers who had taken thalidomide were being born without limbs or shortened limbs or both. And that is a condition called it's called phocomelia is the name of the condition. Now, what is the book actually about? It's a book that tests your moral and ethical conscience in medicine and in clinical trials. That's what it's about. And this book or this experience led to the tightening up of clinical trials and peer review studies and the tightening up of drug regulatory agencies. But in short, it pitted a salesperson who was trying to sell as much of this drug as possible against another salesperson whose moral conscience was being tested and safeguarded against it. And it fascinated me. I read it 3 times in the space of about 3 weeks. In fact, I went through the whole night reading this book and didn't put it down for a moment. And I then said at that time, the industry for me, or where I want my future to be, is going to be in the pharmaceutical industry. So that was very much a turning point. And then later on, when I did get into medicine, much to everyone's disgust, I turned down the place. And I said to my late mom, and she was horrified. She said, "But all Dad ever wanted you to be was a doctor. And now, you're turning this opportunity down." And I said, "Mom, I will and can change many, many more lives doing what I'm doing than a doctor can." And I'm going to fast forward now to the year 2000, 2001. Living in South Africa in those days, we were experiencing something far more severe than what the world experienced during COVID, because we were starting to get to grips with the HIV/AIDS pandemic in South Africa. And in those days, between 300 to 350,000, mainly young South Africans, were perishing from HIV. And if left unarrested, it would have had a significant impact both in the life expectancy of the country. And in fact, the life expectancy did reduce by 10 years during the 2000s on average, but it also would have crippled the economy. And something had to be done. And it was a very difficult time because there were parts of government that were denialists. And it took almost a covert effort behind the scenes to negotiate with a number of stakeholders. And those stakeholders included those in government who believed in the science and weren't denialists, but had to safeguard their backs against those who were against the science. We had to get the clinicians on side, we had to get the patient groups on side, and we had to get the multinational drug companies who held the patents for these drugs on side. So it was a very difficult consortium of stakeholders that you had to get aligned. And the cost of what we called first-line triple cocktail antiretrovirals in those days was around 10,000 US dollars. So I'm going back to the year 2000. So clearly unaffordable, inaccessible to most South Africans and certainly most Africans. So what do we do now? We've got to solve this problem. And we decided as an Aspen management team at the time that we're going to do what we do best, which is we're going to produce quality medicines at affordable prices. But that meant dealing with the biggest obstacle, which is you don't have the patent or intellectual property rights for this. And the multinational companies, that is their lifeblood, is intellectual property. But we were successful, and I led those negotiations. We were successful in securing what we call now voluntary licenses, which have become the norm today. We secured voluntary licenses for a number of the most prominent antiretroviral medicines, which meant we were able to bring the prices from $10,000 down to an affordable and accessible $180. And we went on to save millions of lives, both here in South Africa and also on the rest of the continent. So when I thought back in time and I said, well, you can make a bigger difference in the pharmaceutical industry because you can touch the lives of millions of patients. As a doctor, you maybe have a patient base of 5,000 maybe. So here you can sign a licensing agreement, which I did in the sort of the apex and flagship agreement was with an American biotech company in California called Gilead. They had the silver bullet for HIV called tenofovir, and we managed to secure the rights for tenofovir in January 2004. And that turned the tide against what was going to be the most destructive pandemic South Africa had ever known. As I said, far worse than what we would ever have experienced during COVID. And that was a massive breakthrough. And 10 years later, we were able to restore the life expectancy by the 10 years that had been lost in the preceding 10 years. So that was almost miraculous what happened. There were a couple of other examples I can cite to you, which is in parallel to HIV in 2005, we started experiencing what is called multi-drug resistant TB. So this was TB, tuberculosis, unresponsive to the range of medicines that were available at that time. That were patients became resistant to these medicines, and the comorbidity between TB and HIV in those days was 70%. So we thought, oh my goodness, we're just getting to grips with HIV. And now we've got this next thing, which is MDR-TB. And again, I led a negotiation and the conclusion of these licenses with what is today the world's biggest pharmaceutical company called Eli Lilly. They had these two MDR-TB medicines, and we concluded a licensing, technology transfer, and manufacturing agreement. And again, we were able to reverse what was a very, very concerning epidemiological trend at the time. And then I guess in more recent times, when COVID manifested, I was extremely privileged. The president of the Republic of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, asked me to lead the private sector response to COVID. And initially it was largely an economic discussion. And I said, no, well, if you don't address the pandemic and you start losing tens of thousands of lives, you're going to lose both lives and livelihoods. And if you lose your people, which are your main asset, your human capital, you're not going to have an economy. So there was instantly a huge and significant focus placed on the healthcare aspect. And I'm pleased to say we managed the pandemic quite well in South Africa. That led to another problem, unfortunately, which was we began to see in the least developed and emerging markets significant vaccine and medical countermeasure inequality. So, for example, Africa could not access vaccines at the time. And again, unnecessary lives and livelihoods were lost. And that sparked a whole new movement. You can call it a public health social justice initiative to ensure that if there is to be another pandemic, which inevitably there will be, and we've experienced this already in Africa through Mpox and Ebola. So if there is to be future pandemics, that no one should be left behind in our lifetime. And that means securing vaccines on an equitable basis, securing medicines on an equitable basis for everyone. What was particularly concerning during COVID was that India shut its borders, parts of Europe shut their borders, and part of the United States shut the borders, and it was very difficult to get vaccines and other medicines. Our president here in South Africa, President Ramaphosa, championed this pandemic preparedness response of South Africa and on behalf of Africa. And I must say a great proponent of this was President Emmanuel Macron. He drove the European narrative very successfully. And in fact, I had occasion to meet President Macron 6 weeks ago in Paris, and we were reminiscing about this and just how important his intervention was. So in a different way, I think a Cypriot somewhere in the world, I think has, and I think continues, because there's a lot of work to do in this area, has and continues to drive in some small way this vaccine and medical countermeasure inequity that many countries have experienced, trying to bridge that gap, because you can only really ever have global peace and security if you have health security in every single continent and every single country. If you don't get that right, you're not going to have global peace and security, because people will migrate to countries where there are better health services, and the world can simply not afford it at this point in time. It's a different manifestation of some of the other conflicts that we're seeing, such as Ukraine and in the Middle East. And I'm very proud to tell you that I've been very involved, as has Aspen, in humanitarian relief for the Ukraine. So we are the company in Africa that has contributed the most significantly to the humanitarian relief in the Ukraine. We've contributed around 2.2 million euros of emergency medicines. As you can imagine, many, particularly young Ukrainians, are losing limbs, they're amputees, there aren't medical protocols, prosthesis medical protocols for patients that have lost their eyesight and have lost limbs. So you can imagine how difficult that is. And I think we've been able to assist with that. We've assisted children in Ukraine who were on their deathbeds and could not access pediatric oncology products. We were able to evacuate 52 mainly South African medical students who had to move from the eastern part of Ukraine when the invasion started, left with no belongings and were stranded on the border of Poland, and some went into Slovakia, some went into Poland, some went down as far as Romania, and were able to evacuate these students. So I think this, in a long and winding way, you asked me a question at the beginning: do humble beginnings make you more hungry? And my philosophy in life, and I've just tried to demonstrate, there are many more stories and anecdotes that I could share with you. And I'll be going to meet President Zelensky next month on the 25th of August. I'll be going to meet him. And in fact, he visited South Africa recently. And we had the occasion with who is now the Prime Minister of Ukraine. Her name is Yulia. We had the occasion to reminisce and recollect some of this humanitarian relief, and they were enormously appreciative. And we've also provided humanitarian relief to other countries, including countries like Syria, countries when Turkey or Turkey had their earthquake, we assisted there as well, together with the Greek government. When there's been flooding, when there's been fires in Greece, been able to assist with all of these things, and including in Gaza as well. We've sent humanitarian relief. Okay, so why am I relaying all of these stories? My philosophy and mantra is that you only live in this world for a finite period of time. You don't know how long that's going to be. It could be 50 years, 60, 70 years. Probably the average for a male is 75 years. So you don't know how long you've got. I've just recently turned 60. And you've got to be certain that whilst you are on this earth, on this planet, that you fully utilize and optimize your talents, whatever those talents. And some people have more talent than others. It's not important. What's important is, as long as you have optimized your talents and your skills that you've been given, your God-given skills, to make a meaningful impact and or difference, then you have succeeded. And that is far more beneficial than any economic wealth. So, of course, the hygiene factors and putting food on the table and living a comfortable lifestyle is important. And I've been able to achieve that. And I'm most grateful for that. And neither my family or I are wanting of anything. But far more important for me is that in my time here on this earth, have I utilized my skills, my expertise, my experience, my talents? Have I fully utilized them to make a meaningful difference to society in some form or shape? Have I changed the lives of others? If you've done that, then I think you've succeeded on this earth. So you only really, when you leave and depart, and I don't want this to sound like a somber message, yeah, and I'm not being macabre in any way, but when you leave, you only really leave with two things. You leave with your legacy, and you leave with the impact you've made, and the legacy that you're leaving for your kids. I mean, that's all you really leave with. And that's kind of how I live my life. And I think the rest follows. I think if you do that, I'm in healthcare, if you put the patient at the center of everything, if you're patient-centric, everything else follows. Share prices follow, bonuses and incentives follow, but you have to put what your core business is at the center, and the core business here is a patient out there that's in need, and a patient whose life you're going to change, or a life that you are going to save.
Wow, that is extremely inspiring. I mean, I just want to say that I'm glad you didn't become a doctor, because you have done so much more than you would have done, and your father would be so proud of you. And I'm one of the few people who love to talk about dying, because so many people are afraid of talking about what happens when we die. And I think it's the most natural and the only sure thing. And as you just said so beautifully, we can't take anything with us, but the only thing that we will regret, that most people regret, is the things that they didn't do, not the things they did. So
Correct.
I think you did well, and you are still doing, and I am fascinated, and I now understand a lot more about what you do. And this has become very serious. I want to become a little bit more light now. I want to talk a little bit about travel because it's also most memorable journeys. I know that you travel a lot for work, and I'm fascinated by the people you meet. But do you travel as Stavros Nicolaou with the family? Do you go on holidays?
So I travel in four capacities. I think let's start with me in my professional capacity. And as I indicated at the outset, I was fortunate, aged 21, going on 22, to become the international vice president of the Pharmacy Students Federation. The president was American. He started working the next day. I did half his trips. So at a very early age, I got to travel through Latin America, Central America. So I remember my first Central American country was Costa Rica when I was 22. I got to travel into Europe. So when people talk about Balkanization and the collapse of Yugoslavia, I was able in 1988, 89 already to visit what is today Slovenia, what is today Serbia. So I visited Belgrade, Ljubljana, Zagreb, and it gave me a completely different perspective. And I've continued those travels in my professional career. Aspen is South Africa's most globalized company. We have a presence in 60 countries around the world. I can't say that I go to all 60, but I've traveled to around 88 countries in my lifetime, and many of those visits have been in my professional career. So that's the first sort of bucket. The second bucket is Stavros traveling for government business. So I serve on a number of government advisory councils and or committees, and that means I have to travel occasionally on state business. I've just returned from a visit to China. I accompanied the deputy president to China, so that's kind of the second bucket. The third is me, the tourist. And it usually involves me, the tourist, either on my own or with my spouse or with my spouse and family, or sometimes with friends. I belong to an international group of students who meet once a year in a different location. So we choose first letter of the alphabet and we work our way right down to Z. And we've covered the alphabet once already, and we're halfway through the second bit of the alphabet. So that's me, the tourist. Me, the individual traveling on my own for leisure. I'm a great sports fan and was, and this is a nicer claim because I'm the only person of Cypriot origin to have been the chairman of Cricket South Africa or any or chairman of any of the big cricket playing nations as a chairman, right? So I recently traveled to London, Lords, where the cricket final was taking place between South Africa and Australia. And I'm pleased to say we won and we're the world champions. But that's me, the individual traveling. Very often it is linked to sport. I have a great interest in history, a little in the classics. I've got a great fascination with science. So you'll more rarely find me in a museum or probably a gallery, but not to say that my other real passion is I really enjoy a good bouzouki. Okay.
Wow.
And I really, really enjoy that. And that's my probably when I get to Athens or Cyprus. I mean, that is probably my biggest escape. So there are those four buckets and anything in between that. But I do get to travel extensively. Sometimes I over travel. And my most recent trip to Cyprus was actually in early June, and it was all of a day and a half. So a day
It
and a
was
half,
it
unfortunately, is
was the
all I can
Cyprus
spare.
Diaspora Forum, wasn't it? When you that's
Correct,
how this all came about, because that's
correct,
when
correct.
you that's how Andrew. Thank you, Andrew, for getting me together with Dr. Stavros Nicolaou, because that's how where it all happened. What did you think of Limassol? You hadn't had when was the last time you had been here?
Look, the last time I was there was actually in 2019,
Okay, so it's not that long ago.
and my family have been there more frequently than I have. I mean, my son and daughter have been there more frequently than I have, and only because I have such a heavy travel schedule that it's really difficult to get into Cyprus. But I enjoyed my day and a half, and I think Limassol. I'm going to get a lot of criticism for this because I originate from the Paphos area, but in my view, Limassol is my favorite city, and I'm going to get a lot of criticism for saying that. But it is my favorite city. My favorite town in Cyprus is Limassol.
See, I have always lived in Limassol and I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I love living in Limassol, even though I feel it has lost its soul a little bit with all the developments lately, but it's still Limassol. Listen, I could talk to you forever because I mean there's so much we could, but I normally keep my episodes at about 35, 40 minutes. We're already way above that. So we're gonna, what is your, well, what could Aspen Pharmacare more do for the world? Is there anything that you dream of? Is there something that you could be developed that would change the world? What is it in your opinion?
So look, I think there are two things, and many of these build on our previous track record, because we've always, as I indicated earlier, we've had this mindset that you should place the patient at the center of everything you do. And we're very fortunate. And I'm at a personal level very fortunate to have worked here at Aspen because there are very few careers in one's life that you can pursue where you can um, execute a commercial strategy, but it has such a profound impact on the lives of people and their life expectancy and their quality of life. And I can't think of too many other industries outside of healthcare where you have that privilege. So every single day is a privilege. I never battle to get out of bed unless I've been to the bouzouki, of course, but I never battle to get out of bed without this extreme motivation to go and change the world again the next day. And it's a particularly privileged position to be in, and I'm most grateful. I'm eternally grateful for that. So, what can we do more? I think Aspen will continue focusing on changing the lives, particularly of those who are less fortunate and less well resourced than others in the world, because that's where we've made most of our impact. We're facing a number of new pandemics, which are not so new, but we're only starting to get to grips with them now on the African continent. So Africa was always known as a continent of infectious diseases such as HIV, tuberculosis, malaria. But now we're seeing a rising tide of what we call non-communicable diseases. So these are diseases such as type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases such as strokes, and the most sinister of all of them is type 2 diabetes. And there's a link between type 2 diabetes and what we call cardiometabolic renal complex of diseases. So what does this mean? This means these patients are not insulin insufficient. Their pancreas still produces insulin. However, they cannot absorb sufficiently the sugar into their bloodstream. And this is called type 2 diabetes. And this is lending itself to obese patients and a whole series of other pathologies, such as uh, um, retinal impairment, or you lose your vision. Some people go completely blind. Strokes, heart attacks, and ominously, kidney failure as well. And then they're also getting something called diabetic foot, which leads to an amputation. And this is because There are more than sufficient treatments for type 2 diabetes, but people are not getting to them. They're not accessing these medicines. And we've seen an explosion of a new class of drugs called GLP-1s. And GLP-1s are the drugs that are dealing with diabetes and concurrently also weight loss. Because if you get the weight down, and the weight loss can be as much as 25% in some patients, then everything changes. Their whole health feature changes. Their heart issues reduce, the kidney function improves, the liver function improves, everything just improves. So our ambition at Aspen is to launch a GLP-1. We have already launched one, but we're going to launch a GLP-1 that we manufacture ourselves in about 18 months or so. That's when we estimate. And we're going to make this, as are other companies, I'm not saying we're the only ones, will make this available cost effectively to patients out there, because there are very few drugs like the GLP-1s that can change one's health fortunes so significantly and in such a short space of time. So that's the one thing we're going to do. And the second thing is we're going to continue this African health security and health equity mantra that we commenced during COVID. We're going to be producing African manufactured vaccines for South Africa and the world.
Wow, I think we're going to leave it at that. There is a lot more, but I really, really want to thank you for taking the time to explain all these things too. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be fascinated. Thank you so much for being on Most Memorable Journeys today, Dr. Stavros Nicolaou. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It was a great honor and a delight speaking to you as well, I might add, Elizabeth.
If you enjoy my podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. You will find all the information in the show notes.